think we'll get started. Welcome to a virtual Down Under, the first of our series for SERVSIG, Meet the Service Editors webinar. Okay, so what we're going to have is each of our editors are going to speak for 5 minutes each, and then I'm going to ask them some questions, and then we're going to throw to the audience. So if you can put your questions in the chat, that would be great, and we'll get to that. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Mark Roosevelt to talk and represent the Journal of Services Marketing.
Morning or good evening, depending on where you are. And I'm getting a lot of static, so hopefully everyone can hear me clearly. I just want to take a few moments to talk about new challenges in the service marketplace. And you know, a lot of journals are calling for research on COVID, because clearly, let's face it, our lives every day are being impacted by COVID. And what we're looking for is, we're looking for permanent changes that are occurring in consumption. So, for example, in the U.S.
Sorry, Mark, the sound's really bad. I think, can we ask everyone to turn their videos off, and that might help? And if everyone can mute their microphones as well, please. Let's see how we go.
Is this better?
Yep. Okay, Mark, can you unmute yourself?
Sure. So let me begin.
Right.
Journal Services Marketing has a new call for papers where we're looking for permanent changes in the service marketplace that are taking place because of COVID. So while we're not specifically looking for COVID, we're looking for permanent changes. So let me just give you some examples that are highlighted in the calls. I'll do this quickly. In the US and in many global locations, but especially the US, we're completely seeing the end of the mall. We're seeing malls being repurposed. So for example, Amazon announced in the US that it was actually trying to partner with Simon Properties to take over large chunks of malls. Well, is this the end of the mall? How will consumers respond to malls that are almost turning into warehouses? We talk about the redefinition of physical space. This is a great time for researchers to draw on the humanities literatures to look at theories of place avoidance, place insideness. How exactly do consumers know where to avoid and where to go? We talk about the end of globalization, really the rise of nationalism, farmers markets, people buying again locally. We're seeing the changes of marketplace relationships. What's really interesting is that we're seeing in the COVID environment, either consumers want no relationship, they just want to order, pull up from the retailer, or they're actually risking their health and well-being by having a close relationship with a service provider. So these impacts, we've identified 5 impacts, as well as a series of research questions, should invigorate many young researchers. We really want them to look at long-term impacts. And I know my 5 minutes is up, so I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Great. Okay. Actually, you still had a couple of minutes, but that's okay. All right. Well, our next speaker is going to be Mike Brady from the Journal of Service Research, and he's going to talk about how to send positive signals to a review team. So over to you, Mike. You're on mute, Mike.
Yeah, I can't believe I just did that. I should be good at Zooming by now, right? Well, thanks for having me, Rebecca. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit. And when you asked me about a topic I'd like to cover, my mind immediately went to my everyday job of editing JSR. And one of the things that I wish I would see on a consistent basis are papers that send positive signals to a review team. Because if no one has said this in one of the Meet the Editor sessions to date, then let me say it, which is that my job as an editor is to
Professor Mike, it's muted.
Huh. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Sorry, somehow it muted itself again. So when Rebecca asked me what I would like to talk about today in a very brief window, my mind immediately went to my everyday job of editing JSR. And in those days and those hours, those many hours that I'm editing, one of the things that I wish I could tell potential authors is to make sure that you send positive signals to a review team. And for some of you, this is going to be review, so bear with me, but I get so many papers that fail to send those positive signals to review teams. And if you haven't heard this yet in a Meet the Editors session, I really believe this is true, which is that as an editor, my job is to accept papers, right? It's to accept papers that push service research forward in important ways. And I get excited when I get papers that I think can do that, but I also get concerned when those papers aren't sending positive signals to a review team, because that makes the climb, the process of review a lot more difficult. And so I thought I'd get it out there because I see this all too often, both from papers that have a chance of getting accepted and from papers, especially from papers that might be desk rejected. So what do I mean by sending positive signals to a review team? The way I look at it is when you're reading the literature, and obviously you should do that, there's two ways to read a paper. You can read the paper for what it says, right? So for what the author's content is trying to tell you about a particular topic, and everyone can do that. But there's also another way to read it that I think too few people are doing right now, which is that you can also read papers for how they say it. So read papers for what they say and then how they say it. And what I mean by that is if you look at JSR papers or JSM papers or JSTP or Journal of Service Management, there are frameworks in place at each of our journals that really are like roadmaps for crafting a paper that's to be submitted to that journal. So for example, you might think about how are the introductions set up? Are they short or are they long? And you might notice that, for example, in JCR, if you read that, their introductions are much shorter than, say, JM. And that's something you should pay attention to. Then you can go on to the theory building section and think about, okay, well, how are articles in this journal built using theory? How are they building from the theory? How are they specifying their hypotheses? So if you have a moderation hypothesis, one of the things you should do is look up similar papers that have specified moderation hypotheses and make sure that the style you're using to present your hypothesis is similar to what has already been accepted, right? So this is kind of a roadmap to acceptance. And too often I see that that is not included in the paper, and I have to go back and say, either desk revise it, meaning I'll send it back to the authors and have them revise it so it looks more like a JSR paper, or hope that reviewers see through this kind of thing to the value of the idea. And then it's even more important in the methods section. So for example, you can see what review teams have been concerned about in the past. So for example, no matter what method you're using, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research, surveys, what have you, the tests that you see in the pages of the journal will tell you what the review team was concerned about. So if there are endogeneity tests, for example, with a similar paper to the method that you're using, you better make sure that you've included that same endogeneity test or common method bias, or what are qualitative reviewers going to be concerned about? Well, one of the things that they complain about constantly is to make sure that the authors are clear about how they arrived at their conclusions. So there should be a clear roadmap there, and all of that is within the pages of any journal that you're reading or that you're reading and want to submit to. And so I just wanted to emphasize the importance of that, because if people are sending positive signals to review teams, they're going to be better off in the review process, and the papers that should get into the journal in a way that's much easier, then that actually can happen. And so if that helps, if that's not something that you knew about, you definitely want to make sure that you do that when you're submitting to JSR or whatever journal that you're targeting. And with that, Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect timing, Mike. Okay, so our next editor is Jay Candumpoli from the Journal of Service Management, and Jay's going to talk about service transformation to redesign life. So over to you, Jay. Have we got Jay, or is he? Jay, you need to unmute. Yep, okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Rebecca and Mark. This is a great opportunity to have this conversation. Where would service research go? Obviously, every journal, every researcher would want to write papers that will be cited. And so we are not writing papers for ourselves. We are writing papers for somebody else to read it and cite it, or give them ideas. And that's the purpose of anybody's research. Otherwise, we are writing for ourselves, no good. So we should really think about, what can and what will take us forward. So if we know from today's world, and not confining to the idea of the problems that we are facing right now in the marketplace, but beyond it. So as individuals, society, and the firm are bound to undergo transformational changes. There's no go back in a sense. And every society, every firm, every individual, as we grow, we have made changes in the nature of what life is. And therefore, service research may lead to new perspectives to guide and help and understand those changes that are happening in the marketplace, in the society, in every single person. So that means we could look at a lot of things that are going to change, not what they were in the past, but what would change in the future, whether it is the age-related issues, whether they are technology-related issues, whether they are illness-related issues, or border-related issues. All those things are worthwhile looking into, because we will change. Change is the nature of life. So we definitely need to think in that perspective. Looks like there are a lot of people talking in between. Would you please mute your mics when you come online? Thank you. So what I would like to suggest is that if we are writing for future, we are writing to lead our research into the future, we need to look at future and what will happen or what could happen and how are the changes in life happening. So, think about it. How many of us write letters in a paper and post it to somebody else? We don't do it. I don't remember the last time I posted a letter to somebody. So naturally, all of us as individuals have changed. That means society is changing, and that means the firms are changing. So what type of innovations, what type of perspectives should service research look into where these changes are being conceived within our research? So my thought process is suggesting that we might have to think about not confining ourselves into our simple discipline, but cutting across within multiple disciplines and multiple areas and drawing knowledge from a lot of different areas that might help us to move our know-how within the service research forward. I'll get back to Rebecca, and I'm sure we need more time to questions. So I'm passing on. Rebecca, back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jay. And our last set of editors are Chatura and Mariana to talk on the topic of looking back to go forward. So it's a bit like Back to the Future. So over to you, Mariana and Chatura.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can everybody hear me? Yes, excellent. Thank you for having me with you. It's my pleasure I will try to stick on time, but may I ask if I can share one PowerPoint slide, which I think it can help to visualize my thoughts. Is that possible, Rebecca?
I will stop sharing and you share your screen.
Okay. So,
Mariana, can you put it into presentation mode?
Yes. Okay.
Great.
I was asked to give my perspective as a co-editor of Journal of Service Theory and Practice in terms of what type of service research we are willing to have or we are going to see. And I was trying to reflect how I can summarize my thoughts. I have been a co-editor of JSTP for more than 10 years now. I have authorship or readership or academic experience for longer periods, as you can imagine. I thought of trying to make a comparison between what have been the most important topics of service research in the past and which they might be the ones coming forwards. But I think that was going to be a kind of a supermarket list or a crystal ball prediction in terms of what papers might emerge. So instead of doing that, I tried to summarize my thoughts in terms of how I have seen the evolution of service research from a framework that is very, I would say, known to everyone, a kind of a process approach, an input, process, output kind of mentality or kind of thinking. So in general, I would say, or I will try to classify, type of research that we have seen in services aims to answer three major questions. First of all, there are papers that they try to answer, what is a service? How can we conceptualize it? What are the different features of services? How services differ with products? And then later on, as this topic has evolved, we had been talking about servitization of the economy. We had been talking about the experience economy and not the service economy, the emotional economy and all that stuff. Well, as we have heard before, things have changed. They are always changing, but particularly coronavirus has accelerated change, or it has institutionalized changes that we have been looking for a long time. I see something evolving in this type of research question, whereby more type of papers or studies, they will be focusing on what is an essential service and what is not probably an essential service in an abstract term. What are the characteristics and what are the features of it? And a lot of focus again in terms of transformational services from the point of view that consumers, but also the society nowadays, they would like to see services that they are not consumed to just for hedonic or to be consumed or to increase pleasure, but particularly to change our mindset or the quality of life and the well-being. Not just for the consumer, but for many other stakeholders as well. So the question is the same. What is a service? How do we conceptualize it? What are the features? But the emphasis, as you see, it has changed, and the direction, it is totally influenced by the current trends and influences. Now, the second topic of research are studies that they are looking in terms of how do we innovate services, or how do we design and deliver them? How do we implement them? In the past, a lot of studies, they have paid emphasis in terms of type of innovations, innovation processes, factors helping to innovate, how do we create breakthrough, how do we distinguish between radical innovation, incremental innovation, and all that buzzy words. Well, what we have actually realized because of the coronavirus is that innovation is not something that it happens planned or you really put effort in it. It's a continuous process. You have to make it a continuous process, and several times, particularly during the coronavirus, companies have to innovate even for necessity. They are forced to do it. Now, we are going to more...
Marianne, wrap up in about a minute.
Yes, yeah. So we are going to see more research in terms of what do we mean by innovation, or what are the characteristics of the innovations that companies would need to do without the need to create breakthroughs, because innovation doesn't have to be a breakthrough. How do we design and deliver services? Well, technology has always been the major key. And when I refer to technology, you can imagine of many issues: smart technologies, Internet of the Things, robots, chatbots, big data, you name it. Now, all these have become even more important because of the current situation. The last question, there are studies always that they have been looking in terms of the outcomes of services. Outcomes about satisfaction, loyalty, service quality, performance, metrics, you name it. How have we changed, or how do I see the change? A lot of more emphasis on soft benefits, and that's why everybody now is talking about the purpose economy or the compensative economy, about well-being, responsibility, and all that stuff. But in terms of outputs, although we have previously focused only on probably the two providers, the service provider and the consumer, there is an increased need of studies to look at outcomes at other actors: the society, the environment, the community, the whole society overall. So, to summarize, three major questions. What is a service? How do we innovate and deliver it? And what is the outcome? I would assume these three key questions are going to remain the same. The direction or the emphasis of the research, of course, is going to change. Three key issues that they will be important, and we heard it before: multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or cross-disciplinary research, trauma research, clinical research, mental health, robotics, the empathetic computers. All these keywords, research that it has been done in other disciplines, is equally important and very useful in service research. We need to question our assumptions. Why globalization does not allow localization? The two can also go together. Why, in order to progress, you have to grow? These were assumptions that I don't think they're valid anymore, and we need to question them. And we have even more paradox. Why somebody that has to satisfy himself or herself cannot do it without providing value to others? Why high tech cannot also mean high service? Why, particularly now because of big data and all that stuff, why we can't have privacy but at the same time obscurity? So they're very serious questions to be asked. The current situation, as I said, it probably has not created new issues, but it has accelerated the need to discuss them and do research about it and progress our thinking. So thank you very much. You are on mute, Rebecca.
Okay, now we're at Q&A. So I'd ask everyone to put their questions in the chat. If you've got a question for a particular journal, just put the journal name first. But to kick things off, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to throw to our editors as we wait for the chat to come through. So I'm going to start, Chitura, with you. So if you can unmute. How can a paper make a good theoretical and practical contribution to service research? What advice would you give? And thank you, unmute.
Excuse me. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for inviting. It's a nice opportunity to meet you all. In terms of making a contribution, as you know, there are many different ways of making a contribution, and making a theoretical and practical contribution is something that most journals look for these days, especially at JSTP. We are positioned as the Journal of Service Theory and Practice, and therefore it is quite closely related to our theme. But it's not something unique that most journals these days look for, both a theoretical and practical contribution. But we also recognize that some papers can be more theoretical and others can be more managerially oriented, and the contribution is a matter of striking balance, and some are essentially more on one side than the other. In terms of how to make a contribution, now it often depends on the type of paper, obviously, the type of study you are undertaking. But I also want to highlight the need to communicate the contribution. Now, Mike earlier talked about sending positive signals, and this is a little bit about the communication as well. Sometimes the authors might not bring out the contribution. Sometimes they might not even clearly see the contribution in the paper, and someone else might see it. And this is often something that we hear from reviewers. Reviewers might say, well, the contribution is not clear, and sometimes they give a reject decision. Sometimes they come up with some ideas. Yes, there is some contribution in such and such areas, but you haven't brought it out clearly enough. So I would like to highlight the importance of communicating the contribution, and the fact that it might not be easy to see for yourself what the entire the contribution is, and identifying it and clearly contributing it is extremely critical. In terms of the type of papers that we get predominantly, I would say, 3 types of papers. Some are conceptual papers, and conceptual papers, it's easy to make a theoretical contribution because they expand the boundaries of the topic and domain, sometimes the field, but they are also very hard to write because writing good conceptual papers is challenging. We also get qualitative papers, what I would refer to as qualitative empirical papers, where authors support particular phenomenon using qualitative data, and they would often find a particular context. They might work with a firm or an industry, and you might find it easier to bring out the managerial implications because it is contextual and its relevance is very clear to that particular industry or firm. But often I find reviewers questioning the theoretical contribution, that the contribution is not clear. And one way I find reviewers are convinced is where resulting from this study, people come up with new ideas, new testable propositions, propositions that are more generalizable outside that unique context of firm. And one of the other challenges this type of paper faces is where the results are presented as fairly prescriptive. The recommendations are, okay, this is what managers should do in this particular context. And that also is it's considered a little bit of a limitation because it's limited in terms of scope and context. But predominantly we get quantitative empirical papers, what I would refer to as quantitative empirical papers, which are mostly survey-based or experimental papers, which are based on a set of interrelated propositions. They try to capture the empirical reality, basically. They try to represent the empirical context through a model. And they are fairly, there are standard ways of making a contribution, theoretical contribution. Often they are testing mediation mechanisms, which are about how something leads to another. Sometimes they find moderation effects where they will highlight boundary conditions. Okay, under such and such conditions, this theory does not lead to, this variable does not lead to another variable, or vice versa. So there are some specific guidelines when you are doing this type of research where you can make a theoretical contribution. And of course, the challenge is often papers get rejected because reviewers find that the relationships tested are perhaps not broad enough or not parsimonious because you have thrown in so many different variables. And often they are rejected because they're not examining a set of previously unobserved relationships. So we know these relationships. These variables are very clear. And as a result, we think that we know what they are trying to say. Or sometimes we can even intuitively deduct the set of relationships that are being tested. So as a result, papers get rejected because they think, there is nothing new here. So it is important to find new relationships, new interesting variables that are being talked about. And if you find a nice mechanism, nice set of moderators, yes, it can be more effective in communicating the theoretical contribution. And just one last point about linking the theory to the practice. I often find that some authors bring up a nice vignette at the beginning, a quote or some recent event that has happened. They would cite something from a newspaper, from the media, and that helps to communicate what they are trying to do. And provided what you are doing is in fact related to that particular vignette, and your results are in fact trying to resolve that problem, something that is happening out there in industry. Yes, it helps you to really link the theory to the practice, and the practical implications therefore arise from what you have studied, and they are also related to that particular issue that has been discussed in the news media. So it is easier to show relevance, and you're solving a real problem, and your data in fact helps you to solve managerial problems. By doing that, you might be able to more effectively communicate the contribution that you're trying to make.
Great. We might just wrap that up there. Thank you, Chituru. There's lots in all of that. I'm going to go to Mike with a question, then I'm going to go through a question from our chat. So Mike, I know this is on many people's minds. How will the editorial transition to Minghui be handled? And when exactly is that transition going to occur?
Yeah, good question. So if you hadn't heard, we're really thrilled that Minghui Wang is going to be the next editor-in-chief of Journal of Service Research. So that was announced several weeks ago, and Minghui is in the process of putting her editorial team together. And that's an important point, because I think Minghui will be the first editor of JSR to have co-editors. The idea is that JSR has become such a global journal, as many service journals have become. I think we had 25 different countries represented in the author of JSR articles last year alone. And no more of the papers in JSR came from 22%. No more than 22% of the papers came from one country, I should say. So it is a very global outlet. And I think what Minghui is going to try to do is put together an editor team that is global in scope. So she's obviously in Asia. If you didn't know, she operates out of Taiwan. And I think she's probably going to look for co-editors that are in Europe and or North America. So it's sort of an exciting time in JSR. The scope of how the journal is going to be run is going to change. Some other points about Minghui's appointment: she's actually the first editor-in-chief to be from a field other than marketing. If you didn't know, she's from the IT MIS field, so she's not a marketing professor, and that's very exciting as well, because as we all know, service is a very cross-disciplinary pursuit, right? And the other thing is, in terms of the process of how this is going to happen, I think it's going to be the same as what happened last time. And if you didn't know, when I took over, I started taking new papers in April. And so we expect that to happen from Minghui. And then I took on all papers in July. So we really used the Frontiers in Service Conference as sort of the start point and the stop point for editor teams in JSR. So new papers up through April of 2021 will come to me. And then all papers will go to Minghui starting in July or right after Frontiers in Service Conference.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that. I've got a question in the chat, and Mark, I noticed that you put a comment in. Perhaps you could also put the link to the call for papers in there for people who are interested. So we've got a question here from Agung Sembada, and it's a general question for any of the editors. Given the turnaround times of manuscripts, would it be better for COVID-related research submitted now to aim for implications or impact beyond the pandemic so that it stays relevant, or would COVID-specific themes findings still be worth doing? I'm going to throw first to Mark, because I know that he spoke briefly about that at the beginning, and the call for papers for JSM certainly links to that. So Mark, I'm throwing to you first on that.
From our perspective, we're looking for permanent long-term impacts. So in fact, we really don't even want to see COVID in the title at this point. We want to see permanent long-term impacts. And I think we provide researchers with about 16 different research questions to explore. So we really try to hone in on the research on what we're looking at. So from our perspective, we're going to say, don't put COVID in the title necessarily, look for long-term impacts, the permanent change.
Great. Other editors, do you have any different views on that, or do you concur? Mike, I can see you're about to speak.
I would agree with Mark. I think there's two ways to look at the pandemic. There are effects that are going on right now as we're experiencing the pandemic. And of course, writing about those and getting it through the review process is all but impossible. So you wouldn't want to write a paper that has short-term implications, because hopefully we'll be beyond the pandemic by the time it gets through the review process. So the approach that JSR took out and cultivated a couple of editorials from folks who've been writing in the area of healthcare marketing. So Len Berry and his colleagues put together a really interesting editorial that just now hit online first on the JSR webpage, if you want to check it out. And then also Clay Voorhees and his colleagues created one along the lines of how the pandemic has impacted frontline service workers. But to Mark's point, I think at this point, what I would be looking for are COVID-related papers or pandemic-related papers that speak to long-term implications, because we've all experienced the pandemic. There are effects that are going to reverberate over time. And so if there's a paper that's going to go through the normal process, I would want it to have that long-term scope.
Yep. Okay. So there's a question here from Christina Heinonen. First of all, congratulating the editors for the amazing impact scores for the service journals. And I think as a field, it's truly incredible to see all the service journals doing so well. Her question is, I'm wondering what you think that these results, these impact scores, mean for authors in terms of acceptance and impact. What is your view on the impact of the journal on business, practice and society, and how well is the journal reaching out to researchers in other fields? So there's a couple of different aspects there. So which of the editors would like to have a go at that? I'm thinking maybe Jay or Mariana or Chatura, perhaps, to start with. Or any of the other ones who has the mute button.
Yes,
Sure.
Can I just make a quick comment about the impact of the journals on practice and society? Now, I know that Emerald has an initiative to develop some metrics to capture, as we know, the academic citations, yes, they do capture the impact on our scholars, but the rest of the impact is not captured through, there aren't too many metrics that capture social impact and environmental impact, etc. So there are some indices, but I think Emerald has started actively promoting a set of indices, and I don't think they have published any results as far as I know, but it is definitely a direction that certain publishers are going.
Great. Any other comments, particularly the impact of the journal on business, practice and society? I think that's a really good question, Christina, about preaching beyond our own sort of boundaries. Mark, I can see that you've
Right. I'd like to give my feedback, because for the first time, I'm seeing a lot of authors use their articles on LinkedIn to actually bring practitioners into their research. And I think this is probably the best thing we can do, is that I seriously doubt that many practitioners are going to subscribe given the prices of the paper journals. But what I appreciate and I look forward to and I support is when authors promote their own research on LinkedIn specifically. I'm seeing a lot of practitioners then download the articles, and also take advantage of, when you get 50 free, take advantage of the free downloads. Don't share it with your researcher friends who have access to libraries. Take advantage and share it with practitioners who actually may not be able to afford those downloads. So use LinkedIn wisely.
Yep, that's great. Mike, I can see you've unmuted as well.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Mark said. I think editors love when authors take it upon themselves to promote their own work. We have a lot going on, obviously, and the more you can do to help us get your work out there, the better it's going to be. But actually, the comment I wanted to make has to do with a working group that I'm involved in. It's called RRBM, which stands for Responsible Research in Business and Management. It's a group of really strong, established scholars that I was lucky enough to get involved with. But RRBM has been operating in the management space for quite a while, and it's now coming to marketing. So if you've missed that, make sure you look up RRBM. There's a big website with lots of information about what we're trying to do. And essentially what we're trying to do is to recognize and promote research that speaks to societal concerns, consumer well-being, and practitioner-oriented problems. And so one of the things that happened this year for the first time is that in the marketing journals, RRBM has identified papers that speak exactly to those particular topics. So you get a RRBM seal of approval, if you will, to put on your Vita. And that's actually quite a rare thing and quite prestigious as well. So that's one of the things that JSR is involved with, is making sure that we are in line with what RRBM is trying to promote from a societal standpoint, from a practitioner standpoint, and working very closely with that group.
Great. I've got a question for Jay, and then I'm going to go to one from the chat. Jay, if you can unmute, what advice would you give a young researcher on identifying a topic for their research? So, you know, we know that you've had a lot of experience working with some of the junior academics. So what advice would you give? How do you find a cool topic?
Okay. I hope you heard Mike talk about how do you plan to or create your paper or your research in a way to send that positive image, positive message to the reviewers and the editors. In the same note, what I would like you to think also, whenever we write a paper as a young researcher, what you're trying to do is to joining a conversation with other people who have already been communicating and talking about a particular topic. So you are joining into that conversation, and therefore it's imperative for you to know where that conversation has been going. So without knowing that conversation, don't join in. So for that, we need to really read through a lot of good journals to find out where the conversation is. So rather than just thinking about an idea and trying to write, find out whether somebody or someone has already written about it or what is currently being discussed in the literature. Whether it is whatever field, whether management, marketing, operations, it doesn't really matter. What we need to know, what is the current conversation? Is it technology? Is it COVID? Is it robotics? Whatever it is. That will give us at least an idea to start off. Then we should look into related fields, whether they are economics, whether they are operations, or whether they are in psychology, whether they have talked about something in those lines. If they have, can I draw some ideas from them and bring it to this field, whichever it is, whether it's marketing or management or operations, and therefore show that I have something new to suggest or propose. So as young researchers, we all, have challenges in guiding our PhD students, guiding anybody for that matter, to think about what could be a potentially good area. So review a lot of journals, particularly the ones that you think are leaders in the field. But I know, don't think limiting to one or two journals. Read many. Just read the titles of the papers. I'm not suggesting for you to read the entire paper, just the titles. It'll give you an idea what is being discussed recently. I'm not talking about 10 years ago, right now, maximum 2 to 3 years. That'll give you a pretty decent idea. And then take Mike's idea, how do I put forward so that I give a positive image to or ideas to viewers or editors or whoever is going to read it. And then, of course, your idea is not writing for yourself, right? Idea is writing for somebody else. And therefore, how can I write in such a way that everybody will cite it?
Great. Thank you very much, Jay. We've got a question from Effendi, and what I'm going to do is go to each of the editors and ask them to give one example of this, and then this will be our last round of questions before we draw it to a close. So the question is, what are the new research methodologies that will be more popular in future service research? I'm going to ask each of the editors to tell us, what is coming, what is an example of a new research method that you think will be popular. So I'm going to go to Mark first. Sorry, Mark. And then I'm going to go to Mike, then Mariana, then Chatura, then to Jay. Okay, so that's the order. So throwing to you, Mark. What is
I'm going to answer Effendi's question in a very different way. By the time that a reader, a reviewer or editor gets to the research methodology, they're already in the paper. I'm going to tell Effendi, worry less about the research methodology and focus more on that front end. Think about the contribution, think about being creative. I would rather see a strong creative paper that maybe uses an older methodology, but is interesting. So I'm actually going to tell Effendi's question, worry less about the research methodology, focus more on that upfront creativity and the contribution.
Okay. All right, going to Mike.
Effendi, I think I'm going to take a similar approach to Mark and answer it more generally, which is in saying that the methods that are going to become popular are really going to follow the data that are available, good data that are available. If you look at methods that have gone in and out of popularity, whether it's HLM, well, one of the reasons that became popular is because there were multi-level data that we wanted to harvest and to get information from. You can see that now text-based analyses have become really popular because there's so much text-based data out there. So I wouldn't say that you should sit back and try and predict, without looking at the kind of data out there about the popular methodologies, but really let the methodology follow from the data to which you have access.
Great. Mariana, what's your perspective on any new research methodologies? You're on mute.
Okay, I have already mentioned one in my slide, paradox research. There is a huge disciplinary area on that. Just Google it, you will find a lot of papers in terms of how you do research by using paradox theory. I would also reiterate what it was said before. We have so much data available through technologies. Big data, it's a big issue. How we are able to analyze, interpret them, and make use of them to make sense about what has happened, what is happening. We should also not ignore what is currently being called human sensors, meaning using the consumer to generate the data for you, which has become very trendy. So yes, any methodology that exploits or uses available data, it's going to be useful. Now, what I also see very important in terms of research is because of the limitation of big data, it will be good that we adapt methodologies that they compare findings through different methods, what we always call triangulation, in terms of approaches, in terms of ways to collect data or type of data. I think the triangulation is going to become a very popular research approach as well.
Great, thank you very much. And I was going to say triangulation myself, so Mariana, you said it before me. Okay, Chatura.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think I agree with most of the previous editors, what they said. So I have kind of run out of any new things to say per se. But I would also highlight the fact that it's all often related to the type of data that we have. So with increasingly content being available. Content analysis has become very popular. And another perspective is it also depends on you as a person. What are your preferences? There are qualitative researchers, there are quantitative researchers, there are econometricians. So these methods also have different levels of sophistication. So your access to methods, literature, learning these methods, all these things come into play. And so obviously the method has to fit the kind of data that you have, the problem that you are trying to solve. But there are also practical issues about, okay, how much expertise do I have this method? And do I have access to becoming an expert in these methods? And does it fit with my personality and learning orientation, all those things. So there are lots of different methods out there. And there are many methods with potential. So it's a matter of finding what is of interest to you as well, and in terms of your preference for methodologies as well.
Great. Okay, and Jay, what's your perspective on this?
Thank you, Rebecca. Glad that I'm coming last so that I don't need to repeat what others have said. One of the things that you might have to think about is that all methodologies has got their own challenges and problems. And therefore, the more number of, at least you need to consider multiple methodology to be implemented in one form or another. Maybe at the pre-study or at a confirmatory study or whatever it is, possibly using those things, including the fact that using some practitioners to review what you have done and would they agree, may not be a bad idea. So methodology, of course, goes based on the idea data you have or you're planning to collect. Thank you.
Great. And I think picking up on the point that a few people have made about cross-discipline or transdiscipline research, we would expect to start to see the methods from those fields entering as we see researchers collaborating with people outside of the field. So if you're working with anthropologists, you would expect to see some of those methods. If you're working with economists, you might see econometrics. If you're working with neuroscientists, you would see the neuroscience starting to come in. So I think as we do more cross-discipline research, we will see some of those methods starting to come into services. So on that note, I'm going to draw it to a close and basically flag the next SERVSIG 2020 session. This will be the first of our keynote sessions, the future of services. And as you know, the theme for the conference was high tech versus high touch. And so this is our human perspective. And we have Mike speaking as one of our keynotes. We have Marty Jansen, who's from New South Wales Health in Australia. He's a practitioner. We've got Alison O'Byrne, who's going to talk to us about dark tourism. And in fact, I have to thank Mariana for the introduction that I had to Alison through one of her conferences. And this will be moderated by Janet McCall-Kennedy from University of Queensland. So in order to get the Zoom link for this, we do need you to subscribe. So we won't be sending out the Zoom link and password on Facebook just for a security reason. So if you do want to be kept up to date, please subscribe to the SERVSIG 2020 mailing list. And then we will be able to keep you up to date. It also means we can contact you if there's any changes or anything happens. We've got your details. So please subscribe. You just need to click on the SERVSIG2020.org link, scroll to the bottom of the page, and there's a link there for you to easily join the mailing list on that. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us. It's very difficult to find time zones that we're all awake. So thank you for the early risers, the late evening, and I think Europe had the best deal of all. It was middle of the day. Thank you for coming. Thank you for kicking off SERVSIG 2020, albeit virtually. And we'll see you hopefully at our next session. Please everyone take care through these troubling times, and we wish you all very well. So good night, good evening, good morning.
Take care.